working-class neighborhood nestled on the edge of the city like an old scar on a map, unnoticed by most, yet still alive, still breathing. Narrow streets paved with uneven cobblestones glistened with oil stains from motorbikes and small trucks. On either side, open-air market stalls crowded together, a vegetable stand with bright red tomatoes stacked high, a zahuodian dangling cheap cigarette packs, and elderly women perched on plastic chairs, fanning themselves with bamboo fans in the stifling midday heat. The honking of horns mingled with the calls of vendors, the laughter of children darting between rusty bicycles. It was a chaotic scene, yet brimming with vitality, as if this neighborhood had learned to survive against all odds. In the shade of a small garage at the end of the main street, The Rock leaned against a rusted iron doorframe. Tall and broad-shouldered, a wall of muscle, he wore a faded gray tank top that revealed arms rippling with sinew, veins bulging like ropes. Ripped jeans hugged his sturdy legs, and a black baseball cap sat low, shadowing his deep brown eyes. Eyes that always seemed to gaze into the distance, searching for something even he wasn't sure of. In one hand, he held a half-empty water bottle. The other tapped a rhythm on the doorframe to the rap music crackling from an old speaker inside the garage. To outsiders, he looked like an ordinary mechanic, a quiet laborer blending into the neighborhood's rhythm. But there was something about him, the way he stood, the way his shoulders tensed with each deep breath, that made it impossible to fully ignore him. The Rock wasn't a local. He'd arrived a few years ago from where no one knew and no one asked. One day he showed up with a small bag, rented the garage corner from an old retired owner, and started working. Fixing bikes, changing tires, welding bits of metal. Simple manual tasks that didn't require much talk. The folks around here nicknamed him the Big Guy for his towering frame, though no one dared say it to his face. They'd nod in greeting as they passed, and he'd reply with a brief tip of his cap. He didn't care for chit-chat, didn't pry, and certainly didn't invite trouble. But trouble, like an unwritten law, always found men like him. Today seemed ordinary, or at least it did at first. The sun hung high, casting harsh light over the street, making the tin roofs of the market stalls shimmer like mirrors. The Rock took a sip of water, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and peered out at the neighborhood through the narrow brim of his cap. The crowd was livelier than usual, perhaps because it was the weekend, with people flocking to the market to shop, haggle, and gossip. A fishmonger shouted over the traffic, touting a fresh catch just delivered. A group of kids ran by, kicking a torn plastic ball, laughing as it rolled into the feet of an old man playing chess by the roadside. Everything felt familiar, peaceful, until a different sound sliced through the air. A scream, short, sharp, and laced with pain, erupted from the market's edge, about 100 meters from the Rock's garage. He stopped tapping, the water bottle freezing midair. The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, then murmurs rippled outward like waves. The Rock tilted his head, eyes narrowing beneath his cap. He stepped out of the shade, set the bottle on the garage step, and looked toward the sound. Through the dispersing throng, he saw a small figure crumpled on the ground, clutching an arm, while a larger man loomed over them like a menacing statue. It was Leo Navarro, the 18-year-old fruit seller from the market corner. The Rock knew of him, though they'd never spoken. Leo was a familiar face, skinny with messy black hair, always in an old t-shirt and shorts, standing behind a tidy stall of oranges, mangoes, and bananas. An orphan since a factory fire claimed his parents years ago, he'd been left alone with that little stall as his livelihood. The neighborhood liked Leo, not just for his hard work, but for his smile. Soft, genuine, as if he refused to let his past break him. Today, though, that smile was gone. The man towering over Leo wore a torn leather jacket, his short cropped hair exposing a cobra tattoo coiling up his left arm. Hector the Viper Morales, a name no one dared say aloud, but everyone knew. He was the neighborhood's nightmare, a former boxer who'd once shone in the ring, now the leader of a local gang. He made his living extorting protection money from vendors, using his fists and icy stare to keep everyone in line. The Rock had heard of Hector through whispers, that he was fast as a snake, hit like a sledgehammer, and never forgave defiance. Hector leaned down, his voice a low growl loud enough for the market corner to hear. "Who do you think you are, saying no to me, kid?" Leo, still kneeling, clutching his broken arm, lifted his head to meet Hector's gaze. "My dad didn't pay, and neither will I," he said, voice trembling but firm. The crowd held its breath. Some stepped back. A few shaky phones rose to record. Hector smirked, then without a word drove a brutal kick into Leo's side. The boy collapsed, crying out as his body curled in agony. The Rock stepped fully out of the garage, his pace deliberate. His heavy boots kicked up dust with each step. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't draw attention, but his massive shadow, stretching long under the sun, made a few heads turn. An old woman selling vegetables whispered to her neighbor, "There's the big guy. What's he up to?" No one answered. They just watched, waiting as Leo's groans echoed from the market corner. Hector didn't notice the Rock. He was too busy savoring the moment, standing tall, chest puffed out like a strutting peacock. "Anyone else want to try?" he bellowed to the crowd. "Anyone else want to keep my money?" Silence answered him, broken only by the wind-rustling market tarps and Leo's ragged breathing. Hector spat near the boy's crumpled form, then turned to leave, a bloody lesson left for all to see. But the Rock didn't stop. He moved through the scattering crowd, brushing past a man blocking his path. His eyes locked on Leo, then shifted to Hector, now a few steps away. His chest rose with a deep breath, his hand clenching into a fist the size of a grapefruit. He said nothing. Didn't need to. He just stood there 10 meters from Hector, sunlight glinting off his tanned skin, highlighting every taut muscle. Hector hadn't seen him yet, but the neighborhood had. And the air, already heavy, grew suffocating. The air inside Café Ruiz was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and antiseptic. Carla Ruiz knelt beside Leo Navarro, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed a damp cloth to the gash on his forehead. The boy winced but didn't pull away, his good hand gripping the edge of the wooden chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Blood had crusted around his nose and mouth, and his left arm hung limp, swollen at the elbow where Hector had snapped it. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes, those stubborn, burning eyes, stayed open, fixed on the cracked ceiling as if he could will the pain away. The Rock stood near the window, his massive frame casting a shadow across the small room. He hadn't said much since bringing Leo inside, just watched in silence as Carla worked. His fists were still clenched, the knuckles white from the tension he hadn't released. Outside, the street was settling back into its uneasy rhythm. Vendors shouting half-hearted offers, kids kicking a ball down the road. But the energy had shifted. People moved faster, glanced over their shoulders more often. Hector's presence lingered like a storm cloud that hadn't yet broken. Carla finished wrapping a makeshift bandage around Leo's arm, tying it off with a tight knot. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "He needs a doctor," she said, her voice low but firm. "This isn't just a bruise. His arm's broken, maybe worse." She looked up at the Rock, her dark eyes searching his face for a reaction. "You know what Hector'll do if he finds out you helped him, right?" The Rock didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, the brim of his cap shading his eyes as he glanced out the window. "I've seen guys like him before," he said finally, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "They don't stop till someone makes them." Carla shook her head, standing up and brushing her hands on her apron. "You don't get it. Hector's not just some thug. He's got people, mean ones. They burned down old man Perez's stall last year because he missed a payment. Didn't even blink." She pointed at Leo, her voice cracking. "This kid's all I've got left of his mom. She was my best friend. I can't let him end up dead over some damn pride." Leo shifted in the chair, his jaw tightening despite the pain. "It's not pride," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "It's mine. That stall's mine. They don't get to take it." He tried to sit up straighter, but a sharp hiss escaped his lips as his arm jolted. He slumped back, breathing hard. The Rock turned from the window, his gaze settling on Leo. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just studied the kid, the defiance in his hunched shoulders, the fire in his bruised face. Then he nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "All right," he said. "You held your ground. That's more than most do." Carla threw her hands up. "Great. 2 stubborn mules. That's gonna fix everything." She turned away, muttering under her breath as she grabbed a broom and started sweeping the floor, more out of frustration than necessity. Outside, the sun was dipping lower, painting the street in shades of orange and gold. The Rock stepped closer to Leo, crouching down to eye level. You got a place to stay tonight? He asked. Leo nodded weakly. Back of the stall, there's a cot. He paused, then added, I'm not leaving it. The Rock's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He stood up, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off a weight. Rest up, he said. I'll be around. Then he turned to Carla. Keep an eye on him. Anyone comes sniffing, you tell him he's gone. She stopped sweeping, leaning on the broom. And what about you? You think Hector's just gonna let this slide? The Rock didn't answer. He pulled his cap lower and walked out, the screen door creaking shut behind him. The street greeted him with its usual noise, but there was an edge to it now. Whispers cutting through the chatter, eyes darting toward him, then away. He didn't look back. His boots hit the ground hard, kicking up dust as he headed toward the garage. By the next morning, word had spread. Leo's beating wasn't just another story. It was a spark. People talked in hushed tones over their coffee, behind their stalls, in the alleys where the kids didn't play anymore. The kids said no, they'd say, half in awe, half in fear. And that big guy stepped in. No one knew the Rock's name, but they knew his shadow, the way it loomed over Hector's exit, the way it promised something they hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. But hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this. Hector didn't take defiance lightly, and he wasn't about to let a skinny kid and some stranger rewrite the rules. By noon, he was back, striding down the street with two of his crew in tow. A wiry guy with a shaved head and a stocky one with a bat slung over his shoulder. The crowd parted like water around a shark, vendors ducking behind their goods, shoppers clutching their bags tighter. Hector stopped at Leo's stall, now a pitiful sight with its broken table and scattered fruit. The kid wasn't there, still holed up at Carla's, nursing his wounds. But that didn't matter. Hector kicked over what was left of the table, the wood splintering with a loud crack. Where's the little punk? He barked, his voice carrying over the hum of the street. No one answered. He turned to the wiry guy. Find him. Drag him out if you have to. The wary one nodded and took off toward the cafe, while the stocky one stayed, twirling the bat like a toy. Hector scanned the crowd, his scar twitching as he grinned. Anyone else feeling brave today? Huh? Step up. I got plenty of time. From the garage, the Rock watched. He was bent over a motorcycle, wrench in hand, but his eyes were on the street. The engine grease on his fingers couldn't hide the way they tightened around the tool. He'd seen this play before. The bully flexing, the crowd cowering. It was the same script, different stage. He set the wrench down, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped out into the sunlight. Hector didn't notice him at first. Too busy smashing a crate of oranges with his boot, juice sprayed across the dirt, the sharp citrus smell mixing with the dust. This is what happens, he shouted, when you forget who runs this place. The stocky guy laughed, swinging his bat into another crate for good measure. The Rock moved closer, his steps slow but deliberate, cutting through the crowd like a blade. People stepped aside without a word, their whispers fading into a tense silence. He stopped a few yards from Hector, arms loose at his sides, cap tilted low. The sun beat down on his broad shoulders, turning him into a silhouette, a mountain against the chaos. Hector finally looked up, his grin faltering for half a second before hardening again. Well, well, he said, wiping orange pulp off his boot. The big hero from yesterday. You got a name, or you just here to play Good Samaritan? The Rock didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the smashed stall, then back to Hector, steady and unblinking. The silence stretched, heavy and electric, until Hector laughed, a sharp, forced sound. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or you just dumb as you look? The stocky guy stepped forward, bat raised. Want me to loosen him up, boss? Hector waved him off. Nah, let's see what he's got. He cracked his knuckles, stepping closer, his stance shifting into something practiced. Fists up, weight on his toes. You think you're tough, huh? Picking up strays like that, kid? Let's see how tough you are when I'm done with you. The Rock still didn't speak. He rolled his neck once, a slow pop echoing from the joints, then planted his feet wider. His hands stayed loose, but there was a shift in him, a tightening, a readiness that didn't need words. The crowd held its breath, phones trembling in shaky hands. Hector lunged, fast as a whip, throwing a jab aimed at the Rock's jaw. It was a boxer's punch, tight and precise, honed from years in the ring. But the Rock moved, Not fast, not flashy, just enough. His head tilted, the fist grazing air where his face had been. Before Hector could reset, the Rock's hand shot up, grabbing the outstretched arm and twisting it hard. Hector grunted, stumbling forward, his momentum turned against him. The stocky guy charged, bat swinging high. The Rock released Hector and ducked, the wood whistling over his head. In one fluid motion, he drove his shoulder into the guy's gut, lifting him off the ground and slamming him down onto the dirt. The bat clattered away, rolling under a stall. The guy groaned, clutching his stomach, out of the fight before it even started. Hector recovered, spinning back with a wild hook. This one clipped the Rock's cheek, a shallow sting that drew a thin line of blood. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped in, closing the distance so fast Hector barely had time to blink. A massive fist crashed into Hector's ribs, a dull thud that made the man stagger back, gasping. The Rock followed with an elbow to the shoulder, knocking Hector off balance, but he didn't finish it. He stepped back, fists still up, watching. Hector coughed, clutching his side, his face twisting with rage. "You're dead," he spat, voice ragged. "You hear me? Dead." He straightened, chest heaving, and pointed at the Rock. "This ain't over." Then he turned, shoving through the crowd, the wiry guy scrambling back from the cafe to join him. The stocky one limped after, still wheezing. The street exhaled. People stared, some in shock, some in quiet awe. The Rock wiped the blood from his cheek with his thumb, then turned to the ruined stall. He bent down, picking up a single unbroken orange, rolling it in his hand like it was a grenade. His eyes scanned the crowd, not threatening, just assessing. Then he walked back to the garage, the orange still in his grip, leaving the street buzzing behind him. Back at Cafe Ruiz, Carla watched from the window, her broom forgotten on the floor. Leo sat up straighter, peering through the glass despite the pain. "Who is he?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Carla shook her head. "I don't know, kid, but he just kicked a hornet's nest." She glanced at Leo, her expression softening. "And you'd better hope he's ready for what comes next." Across town, Hector stormed into a rundown warehouse, his crew trailing behind. He kicked over a chair, the metal clanging against the concrete floor. "Get the boys," he snarled, his scar twitching with every word. "All of them. That big bastard's gonna learn what happens when you cross me." The wiry guy nodded, pulling out a phone. The stocky one slumped against a wall, still holding his gut. Hector paced, fists flexing, his mind racing. He'd underestimated the stranger, and that stung worse than the punch. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. At the garage, the Rock sat on an old crate, peeling the orange with slow, deliberate movements. The sharp scent filled the air as he broke it apart, popping a segment into his mouth. His jaw worked silently, eyes fixed on the street beyond. He'd bought Leo some time, maybe shaken Hector's grip a little. But he knew men like that didn't back down. They doubled down. He finished the orange, tossing the peel into a rusted bin. Then he stood, rolling his shoulders again, the muscles rippling under his skin. Whatever came next, he'd be ready. The kid had held his ground. Now it was his turn. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets as the day bled into dusk. The marketplace had quieted, vendors packing up their stalls with hurried hands, their voices hushed as if afraid to draw attention. Word of the midday scuffle had spread like wildfire. The Rock's stand against Hector wasn't just a rumor now. It was a crack in the wall of fear that had held the neighborhood captive for years. But cracks could widen, or they could collapse under pressure, and everyone knew Hector wouldn't let this one stand. The Rock sat on a stool outside the garage, his massive frame dwarfing the rickety metal seat. He'd swapped the greasy rag for a pair of old boxing gloves, the leather worn but sturdy, pulled from a duffel bag stashed under a workbench. He wasn't taping his hands or shadowboxing, nothing theatrical. He just flexed his fingers inside the gloves, testing the fit, the creak of the leather blending with the distant hum of a motorcycle engine. His cap was pulled low, shading his eyes, but they stayed sharp, scanning the street with the patience of a predator waiting for prey. Inside Cafe Ruiz, Leo Navarro leaned against the counter, his good hand clutching a glass of water Carla had forced on him. His face was a mess, a swollen bruise blooming under his left eye, dried blood crusting his lip. But he refused to lie down. "I need to get back out there," he said, voice rough but determined. That stall's all I've got. Carla shot him a look, her arms crossed tight over her apron. You can barely stand, Leo. You go out there now, and Hector will finish what he started. She glanced out the window, where the Rock's silhouette loomed against the fading light. Let that guy handle it. He's already in deep. Leo shook his head, setting the glass down with a shaky clink. He doesn't even know me. Why's he doing this? Carla didn't answer right away. She chewed her lip, eyes flickering with something between worry and wonder. Some people don't need a reason, she said finally. They just see something wrong and fix it. The street was nearly empty when Hector returned. He didn't come alone this time. 3 figures flanked him, each one meaner than the last. The wiry guy from earlier was back, a switchblade glinting in his hand as he twirled it nervously. The stocky one with the bat limped slightly, his pride bruised more than his body. The third was new, a hulking brute with a shaved head and knuckles wrapped in dirty tape, a grin splitting his face like he lived for nights like this. Hector led them, his stride long and purposeful, the scar on his face catching the last rays of sunlight like a jagged warning. He stopped in the middle of the street, just outside the garage's shadow, and cracked his neck with a loud pop. "Hey, big man!" he shouted, voice echoing off the rusted rooftops. "You want to play hero? Come out here and play." The Rock didn't move at first. He stayed seated, gloves resting on his knees, head tilted slightly as if sizing up the noise. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, the stool creaking under the shift of his weight. He stepped into the street, boots thudding against the dirt, each step a statement. The gloves hung loose at his sides, but his shoulders were squared, his chest broad like a wall, ready to take whatever came. Hector grinned, spreading his arms wide. "Look at this guy. Thinks he's some kind of badass." He turned to his crew, laughing. "What do you think, boys? Should we give him a warm welcome?" The hulking brute stepped forward, cracking his taped knuckles. "Let me soften him up, boss," he rumbled, voice thick with anticipation. Hector nodded, stepping back to watch, his eyes glinting with malice. The brute charged, a freight train of muscle and bad intentions. He swung a wild haymaker, aiming to cave in the Rock's skull with one blow. But the Rock was ready. He ducked low, the fist sailing over his head, then exploded upward, driving his gloved fist into the brute's jaw. The crack was deafening. Teeth clattered to the ground like loose change as the guy stumbled back, eyes rolling. The Rock didn't let up. He grabbed the brute's shirt, yanked him forward, and slammed a knee into his gut. The air whooshed out of the man in a pained grunt, and he crumpled to the dirt, out cold before he hit the ground. The crowd, what little was left, gasped, some peering from behind stalls, others from cracked windows. Phones were out again, shaky hands capturing the blur of violence. Hector's grin faded, replaced by a snarl. "Get him!" he barked, and the wiry guy and the stocky one rushed in. The wiry one came first, blade flashing as he slashed at the Rock's chest. The Rock sidestepped, the knife cutting air, then caught the guy's wrist in a grip like iron. He twisted hard, the blade dropping with a clink as the wiry one yelped. A quick jab to the nose sent him reeling, blood spurting between his fingers as he hit the ground. The stocky one swung his bat, aiming for the Rock's ribs, but the Rock pivoted, taking the blow on his forearm. Pain flared. He felt it, but he didn't show it. He ripped the bat from the guy's hands, snapped it over his knee like a twig, and tossed the pieces aside. A straight punch to the chest dropped the stocky one next to his buddy, gasping for air. Hector clapped slowly, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. "Not bad," he said, stepping forward. "Not bad at all, but you're out of your league, big man." He slipped off his jacket, letting it fall to the dirt, revealing arms corded with lean muscle. He raised his fists, slipping into a boxer's stance. Light on his feet, eyes locked on the Rock. "Let's dance." The Rock didn't waste words. He mirrored Hector's stance, gloves up, body loose but coiled. Hector moved first, darting in with a flurry of jabs. Fast, precise, a boxer's rhythm. The Rock blocked most, his forearms absorbing the sting, but one slipped through, snapping his head back with a cut across his lip. Blood trickled down his chin, but he didn't blink. He countered with a heavy hook, aiming for Hector's jaw. Hector ducked, grinning, and fired back with an uppercut that grazed the Rock's ribs. They traded blows, a brutal ballet of power and speed. Hector was quick, his punches snapping like whips. But the Rock was a tank, Every hit he took only seemed to fuel him. He caught Hector's arm mid-jab, yanked him close, and drove an elbow into his shoulder. Hector grunted, stumbling, but rolled away, shaking it off. "You hit like a truck," he spat, circling. "But I've taken worse." The Rock didn't reply. He advanced, relentless, forcing Hector back with sheer presence. Hector threw a desperate hook, but The Rock blocked it, then unleashed a combo. A jab to the face, a cross to the chest, and a monstrous uppercut that lifted Hector off his feet. The ex-boxer flew back, crashing into a stack of crates, wood splintering around him. He slid to the ground, coughing, blood dripping from his mouth. The street went still. The Rock stood over him, breathing hard, gloves stained with sweat and a smear of Hector's blood. He didn't gloat, didn't pose, just watched, waiting to see if the fight was done. Hector pushed himself up, shaky but defiant. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped, spitting red onto the dirt. "You're a dead man walking." He staggered to his feet, waving off his groaning crew. "Enjoy your little win. Next time, I bring the real heat." He turned, limping away, his shadow stretching long and ragged behind him. The Rock stayed rooted, watching until Hector disappeared around a corner. The crowd murmured, a mix of disbelief and cautious relief. He flexed his hands, wincing slightly as the ache from the bad hit sank in, then turned back to the garage. The fight wasn't over. He knew that. But he'd drawn a line and Hector had crossed it. Inside Café Ruiz, Carla and Leo had watched it all through the window, her hand gripping his shoulder to keep him from running out. "He's crazy," she whispered, half to herself. "Crazy and good." Leo didn't respond. His eyes were on the Rock, tracking every move, every punch. For the first time since Hector's boot had cracked his ribs, he felt something shift inside him. Not just pain, but possibility. Back at the warehouse, Hector slammed through the door, kicking over a table in a rage. His crew followed, battered and silent. "Get me the phone," he snarled, wiping blood from his lip. The wiry guy handed it over, still nursing his nose. Hector dialed, pacing as it rang. When a voice answered, he didn't waste time. "It's me. Got a problem. Big guy thinks he's tough. I need backup. The heavy hitters." The voice on the other end chuckled, low and cold. "You're slipping, Viper. All right, I'll send some boys. But you owe me." Hector hung up, tossing the phone onto a crate. He stared at the wall, his scar twitching. "You're mine, big man," he muttered. "All mine." At the garage, the Rock peeled off the gloves, tossing them onto the workbench. He grabbed a rag, wiping the blood from his face, then sat back on the stool, staring out at the darkening street. The fight had been a warning, to Hector, to the neighborhood, to himself. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't come here for it, but now it was here, and he wasn't backing down. From the shadows of the garage, a figure emerged. Jamal Slim Carter, a lanky 25-year-old mechanic who'd been watching from the sidelines. "That was insane, man," he said, voice low. "You just took on 4 of them like it was nothing." The Rock glanced at him, then back to the street. "Wasn't nothing," he said. "Just the start." Jamal hesitated, then stepped closer. "Hector's not gonna let this go. I've seen him mad before. He'll come back harder." The Rock nodded, slow and sure. "Let him come." The night settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, the usual hum of life replaced by an uneasy quiet. Street lights flickered, casting weak pools of yellow across the cracked pavement, and the air carried the faint tang of smoke from a vendor's grill left smoldering too long. At the garage, the Rock sat on the edge of a workbench, a dim bulb overhead throwing shadows across his broad frame. His gloves were off, hands resting on his knees, the knuckles raw and bruised from the fight. A thin cut on his cheek glistened with fresh blood, but he didn't bother wiping it. His cap sat beside him, revealing eyes that stared into the dark, calm but calculating. Jamal Slim Carter hovered nearby, filling with a wrench he didn't need, his lanky frame shifting nervously. "You sure about this, man?" he asked, voice low like he didn't want the night to hear. "Hector's crazy, but he's connected. I've seen guys roll through here before. Big talkers, tough guys. They all end up gone when he calls in favors." The Rock didn't look at him. He picked up a bottle of water, took a slow sip, then set it down with a soft clink. "He can call whoever he want," he said, voice steady as stone. "Doesn't change what's coming." Jamal shook his head, tossing the wrench onto a pile of tools. You're built different, I'll give you that. But this ain't just fists anymore. He's got a crew. Real muscle, not those clowns you dropped today. The Rock finally turned, his gaze pinning Jamal in place. You scared? Jamal hesitated, then shrugged. Yeah, a little. Ain't ashamed to say it. You should be too. The Rock grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so dry. Been scared before. Didn't stop me then. Won't now. He stood, rolling his shoulders, the muscles rippling under his sweat-stained shirt. Keep your eyes open, Slim. Let me know if you see anything. Jamal nodded, though his frown said he wasn't convinced. All right, man, but don't say I didn't warn you. He slipped back into the garage, leaving the Rock alone with the night. At Café Ruiz, Leo Navarro sat slumped against the wall, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His arm was in a crude sling Carla had rigged from an old towel, and his face was a map of bruises, but he refused to stay down. I can't hide here forever, he said, his voice rough but firm. That stall's mine. I'm going back tomorrow. Carla stood over him, hands on her hips, her dark hair falling loose from its tie. You're going back to get yourself killed is what you're doing, she snapped. Hector's not playing, Leo. You saw what he did today, and that was before your big friend pissed him off. Leo's jaw tightened. He's not my friend. I didn't ask him to do anything. Maybe not, Carla shot back, but he did it anyway. And now you're both targets. You think Hector's gonna let that slide? He's probably out there right now planning how to bury you both. Leo looked away, his good hand balling into a fist. I don't care. I'm not running. Carla sighed, softening despite herself. She knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. You're just like your mom, you know that. Stubborn as hell. She'd be proud, but she'd also smack you for being this dumb. Leo didn't respond, but his eyes glistened for a moment before he blinked it away. Carla stood, grabbing a rag to wipe the counter, though it was already clean. Just stay here tonight, okay? Let me figure something out. Hector didn't waste time licking his wounds. By midnight, the warehouse buzzed with new faces. 6 men, each one harder than the last. They weren't locals. These were hired muscle, brought in from the city's underbelly. One had a jagged scar across his throat. Another carried a chain wrapped around his fist like a bracelet. The leader was a lean, tattooed man with cold gray eyes and a sawed-off shotgun slung over his shoulder. He went by Razor, and his reputation preceded him, a fixer for the kind of people who didn't ask questions. Hector paced in front of them, his ribs still aching from the Rock's uppercut, his pride stinging worse. Big guy thinks he's untouchable, he said, voice sharp with venom. Took out 3 of mine like it was a warm-up. I want him broken. Him and that kid. No games this time. Razor smirked, leaning against a crate. You said that last time, Viper. What's different now? Hector stopped, glaring. You're different. I'm paying you to make this quick and ugly. Burn the stall, trash the cafe, whatever it takes. Just get it done. Razor nodded, twirling a knife between his fingers. Fine, but it'll cost extra if he's as tough as you say. He's tough, Hector admitted, spitting the words like they tasted bad. But he's one guy. You're 6. Do the math. The crew laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the warehouse. Razor tucked the knife away. All right, we move tonight. Where's he at? Hector grinned, his scar twisting. Garage down the street. Can't miss him. Looks like a damn wall with legs. The attack came just before dawn, when the sky was still a bruised purple and the street lay silent. The Rock was dozing on a cot in the garage, one arm slung over his eyes when the first sound hit. A low rumble, like thunder rolling in. He snapped awake, senses sharp, and rolled to his feet just as the roar of engines cut through the quiet. Headlights pierced the darkness, 3 motorcycles tearing down the road, followed by a battered pickup truck. He grabbed the gloves from the workbench, slipping them on with practiced speed, and stepped outside. The bikes skidded to a stop, kicking up dust, their riders dismounting with weapons in hand, a crowbar, a chain, a tire iron. The truck screeched to a halt behind them, Razor and 2 more jumping out, the shotgun glinting in the faint light. The Rock didn't wait for them to talk. He charged, closing the distance before they could spread out. The first biker swung the crowbar, aiming for his head, but the Rock ducked, grabbing the guy's arm and twisting it back. A sickening pop sounded as the shoulder dislocated, the crowbar clattering to the ground. The Rock shoved him into the second biker, sending them both sprawling. The chain guy came next, whipping the metal links at the Rock's legs. It caught his shin, a sharp sting that made him grunt, but he powered through, grabbing the chain mid-swing and yanking hard. The guy stumbled forward, right into a gloved fist that smashed his nose flat. Blood sprayed, and he dropped, clutching his face. Razor barked orders from the truck. "Take him down!" The tire iron guy rushed in, swinging low, but The Rock sidestepped, driving an elbow into the back of the man's neck. He crumpled, out cold. The last two from the truck advanced, one with a machete, the other bare-handed but built like a bull. The machete slashed at The Rock's chest, slicing his shirt and grazing skin. He hissed, blood trickling down his side, but grabbed the guy's wrist, snapping it with a twist. The blade fell, and a knee to the gut finished him. The bull charged, tackling The Rock into the garage door. The metal buckled under their weight, and for a moment, The Rock was pinned, the guy's fists hammering his ribs. Pain flared, but he roared, shoving back with raw strength, lifting the man off his feet and slamming him onto the hood of a junked car. The windshield cracked under the impact, and the bull went limp. Razor raised the shotgun, aiming square at The Rock's chest. "Enough!" he snarled, finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a wrench flew from the shadows, smacking his hand. The gun went off, the blast tearing into the dirt as Razor cursed, clutching his wrist. Jamal stepped out, another tool in hand, his skinny frame trembling but defiant. The Rock didn't hesitate. He lunged, tackling Razor into the truck's side. The shotgun skidded away as they grappled, Razor's knife flashing out. It nicked The Rock's arm, but he grabbed the blade hand, slamming it against the metal until it dropped. A brutal headbutt ended it. Razor's eyes rolled back, and he slumped unconscious. Breathing hard, The Rock stepped back, blood dripping from his arm and side. The street was a wreckage of bodies and bikes, the air thick with dust and the smell of gasoline. Jamal ran up, wide-eyed. "Holy shit, man! You okay?" The Rock nodded, wincing as he pressed a hand to his ribs. "Yeah, thanks for the assist." Jamal managed a shaky grin. "Couldn't let you have all the fun." Hector's retaliation didn't stop there. An hour later, flames licked up from Leo's stall, the dry wood catching fast. A Molotov cocktail hurled from a passing bike turned it into an inferno before anyone could react. By the time Carla and Leo stumbled out of the cafe, it was too late. The stall was a pile of ash and charred fruit, the last piece of Leo's family gone. Leo fell to his knees, staring at the ruin, his good hand clawing the dirt. "No," he whispered, voice breaking. Carla pulled him back, tears streaking her face, but he shook her off, staggering toward the ashes. The Rock arrived, limping slightly, Jamal at his side. He took in the scene, the fire, the destruction, the kid's despair, and his jaw tightened. "They hit hard," Jamal said, voice low. "This is personal now." The Rock didn't respond. He walked to Leo, crouching beside him. "You're still here," he said, quiet but firm. "That's what matters." Leo looked up, eyes red and furious. "They took everything." The Rock shook his head. "Not everything. Not you." He offered a hand, and after a moment, Leo took it, letting The Rock pull him to his feet. Carla stepped forward, voice trembling. "What now? They won't stop." The Rock straightened, his bloody arm glistening in the firelight. "Now I stop them." At the warehouse, Hector paced, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Razor sat against a crate, head bandaged, his crew licking their wounds. "He's still standing," Razor growled. "You didn't say he was a damn machine." Hector flicked the cigarette away, sparks scattering. "Doesn't matter. We hit him where it hurts. The kid, the street, he'll break." Razor smirked, wincing as he stood. "Keep telling yourself that. Next time I'm bringing more than bikes." Hector's eyes narrowed. "Do it. I want him in the ground." Back at the garage, The Rock sat Leo down on the cot, handing him a bottle of water. Jamal hovered nearby, restless. "They'll come again," he said. "Bigger, meaner." The Rock nodded, taping his hands with slow precision. "Good. Makes it easier to find them." Leo looked up, voice steady despite the pain. "I want to help. Teach me something. Anything." The Rock paused, studying him. Then he tossed him a roll of tape. "Start with your hand, one step at a time." As the night deepened, the garage became a makeshift war room. 3 against an army, bound by grit and a shared refusal to bend. Hector had escalated the fight, but The Rock was ready to push back harder. Dawn broke over the neighborhood, a thin gray light creeping through the haze of smoke that still lingered from Leo's burned-out stall. The street was a ghost town. Shutters closed, stalls abandoned, the air thick with the acrid scent of ash and gasoline. The Rock stood outside the garage, his silhouette stark against the rising sun. His shirt was torn, blood crusted on his arm and side from the night's ambush. But he moved with purpose, taping his hands with slow, deliberate wraps. The gloves were back on, the leather scuffed but tight, ready for what was coming. Inside, Leo Navarro sat on the cot, his good hand fumbling with a roll of tape the Rock had given him. His broken arm was still slung, but his face was set. No more tears, just a quiet fire burning in his eyes. Jamal Slim Carter paced nearby, a crowbar in his grip, his usual jittery energy sharpened into something harder. "They're coming today," he said, voice low. "I heard it from a guy at the bar. Hector's pulling out all the stops." The Rock didn't look up from his taping. "Let 'em," he said, his rumble of a voice steady as ever. "Ends today." Leo finished wrapping his hand, flexing his fingers awkwardly. "I'm not sitting this out," he said, standing despite the wince that crossed his face. "They took my stall. I owe 'em." The Rock glanced at him, then nodded once. "Stay close. Do what I say." He turned to Jamal. "You too. We hit 'em where they live." Jamal gripped the crowbar tighter. "Warehouse, right? That's where they hole up." The Rock pulled his cap on, shadowing his eyes. "Yeah, we take the fight to them. No more waiting." The warehouse loomed at the edge of the neighborhood, a hulking shell of rusted metal and broken windows, its walls tagged with faded graffiti. Inside, Hector. The Viper Morales barked orders, his scar twitching with every word. His crew was bigger now. 10 men, armed to the teeth. Razor was back, shotgun reloaded, his head still bandaged but his smirk intact. The others carried chains, pipes, and a couple of pistols, their faces a gallery of scars and sneers. A pickup truck idled outside, loaded with gas cans and Molotovs. Hector wasn't just planning a fight, he was planning a massacre. "They'll come," Hector said, pacing with a tire iron in hand. "The big bastard's too dumb to run, and the kid's too proud. We finish him here, then burn that whole damn street to the ground." Razor leaned against the truck, twirling his knife. "Hope he's worth it, Viper. I don't like bleeding twice for the same job." Hector glared but didn't snap back. "He's one guy. We've got numbers. He bleeds, he breaks. Simple." The warehouse doors rattled, a low thud echoing through the space. Hector froze, his crew turning as one. Another thud, heavier, then the screech of metal giving way. The doors burst open and the Rock stepped through, alone, his boots kicking up dust. His gloves gleamed in the dim light, his chest rising with a deep, controlled breath. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate, just walked straight in, a mountain moving toward a storm. Hector laughed, sharp and bitter. "You got balls, I'll give you that. Too bad they're about to be scattered across my floor." He waved a hand. "Take him!" The crew surged forward, a wave of steel and fury. The Rock met them head on. A pipe swung at his head. He ducked, grabbing the guy's arm and snapping it over his knee with a wet crack. The man screamed, dropping, and the Rock drove a fist into the next one's chest, sending him crashing into a crate. A chain whipped at his back, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. But he spun, catching the chain mid-air and yanking the attacker forward into a crushing elbow to the jaw. Razor fired the shotgun, the blast tearing through a stack of boxes as the Rock rolled behind a pillar. Splinters flew, but he was up fast, charging Razor before the man could reload. He tackled him into the truck, the shotgun skidding away, and slammed Razor's head against the hood. The fixer went limp, knife clattering from his hand. Hector shouted, "Get the guns!" 2 men drew pistols, but before they could aim, a crowbar flew from the doorway, smacking one in the temple. He dropped, out cold. Jamal sprinted in, Leo hobbling behind, a length of pipe in his good hand. "Go!" Jamal yelled, diving at the second gunman. They grappled, the pistol firing wild into the ceiling as Jamal wrestled it free. Leo swung his pipe at a chained guy rushing the Rock, the metal ringing as it hit the man's shoulder. He stumbled, and the Rock finished him with a hook that sent him spinning into a wall. "Stay back!" The Rock roared at Leo, shoving him toward cover as another pipe swung at his head. He blocked it with his forearm, grunting at the impact, then grabbed the attacker's throat, lifting him off the ground and hurling him into a pile of crates. Hector watched his crew fall, his grin gone, replaced by a snarl. He gripped the tire iron tighter, stepping into the fray. "You're mine, you son of a bitch!" He swung hard, aiming for the Rock's skull. The Rock sidestepped, the iron grazing his shoulder, then countered with a jab that snapped Hector's head back. Blood sprayed from his nose, but he ducked the next punch, driving the tire iron into the Rock's ribs. Pain exploded through the Rock's side, his breath hitching, but he powered through, grabbing Hector's arm and twisting it until the iron fell. Hector snarled, throwing a boxer's combo, jab, cross, hook, fast and tight. The Rock took a hit to the jaw, blood trickling from his lip, but blocked the rest, then retaliated with a monstrous uppercut. Hector's feet left the ground, his body slamming into the truck's grill with a metallic crunch. The warehouse was chaos. Bodies strewn across the floor, crates shattered, the air thick with dust and grunts. Jamal wrestled the last gunman down, smashing his head with the crowbar's blunt end. Leo, panting, swung his pipe at a straggler, knocking him out cold. The Rock stood over Hector, chest heaving, blood dripping from his face and hands. Hector coughed, rolling to his knees, one hand clutching his ribs. "You think you won?" he rasped, spitting red onto the concrete. "This ain't over." The Rock didn't let him finish. He grabbed Hector by the collar, hauled him up, and drove a knee into his gut. Hector doubled over, gasping, and the Rock spun him, slamming his face into the truck's hood. The metal dented, blood smearing across it as Hector slumped, barely conscious. The Rock stepped back, fists still raised, watching for any twitch. Silence fell, broken only by the creak of settling debris. Jamal dropped the crowbar, hands on his knees, breathing hard. "Damn, man, we did it." Leo staggered forward, pipe slipping from his grip. He stared at Hector's crumpled form, then at the wreckage around them. "It's done," he said, voice shaking but sure. The Rock wiped his lip with the back of his glove, nodding. "Yeah, done." They left the warehouse as the sun climbed higher, its light spilling over the broken doors. Hector's crew lay scattered, some groaning, some still. The truck sat silent, its grill crumpled, a testament to the fight's end. The Rock walked out first, Leo and Jamal trailing, their steps uneven but steady. Back at the street, Carla ran up as they emerged, her face pale with worry. "You're alive," she breathed, pulling Leo into a hug despite his wince. She looked at the Rock, then Jamal. "All of you." Jamal grinned, weary but proud. "Told you he's built different." The Rock didn't smile. He pulled off his gloves, tossing them onto the garage steps, and sat heavily on a crate. Blood stained his shirt, his arms, but he didn't seem to care. He looked out at the street, the ashes of Leo's stall, the shuttered shops, and exhaled, long and slow. Leo stepped closer, his sling hanging loose. "Why'd you do it?" he asked, voice quiet. "You didn't have to." The Rock met his gaze, eyes steady under the cap's brim. "You stood up," he said. "Someone had to back you." Leo nodded, swallowing hard. "Thanks for everything." Carla put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "What now? Hector's down, but this place, it's still a mess." The Rock stood, rolling his neck with a crack. "Now you rebuild. Start with what's left." Word spread fast. By noon, people trickled out of their homes, peering at the garage, whispering about the fight. A few approached, an old man with a nod, a vendor with a quiet, "Thank you." No cheers, no fanfare, just a cautious gratitude that grew with every passing hour. Hector's reign was over. Razor and the crew were gone, some hauled off by cops tipped by a nervous bystander, others slinking away into the city's shadows. The warehouse stood empty, a hollow shell of what it had been. The Rock didn't stay for the aftermath. He grabbed his duffel from the garage, slinging it over his shoulder. Jamal watched, leaning on the crowbar. "You're leaving?" The Rock nodded. "Job's done." Leo stepped forward, offering his taped hand. "You ever come back? You've got a place here." The Rock shook it, firm but brief. "Take care of it, kid." He turned to Carla. "Keep him out of trouble." She smirked, tired but relieved. "I'll try." With that, he walked off, his shadow stretching long down the street. The sun climbed higher, the neighborhood stirring back to life. Vendors reopening, kids kicking a ball, voices rising over the hum. The Rock didn't look back. He didn't need to. The fight was won. The line held.